And I guess what I wanted to say was that I wanted to bring a little bit of a spatial perspective here. We've talked a lot about these economic inequalities throughout the day, but I also want to talk and like how much things cost and how much the deficit is between what we need and what we have. But also I want to talk about where that's happening, and I think that's been pointed out a few times, specifically by people offering questions. My research has been looking at what I call zones of exclusion on the one hand and zones of extraction on the other. So the city as being like having these really protected areas of low density housing that through both their economics and their urban form are quite exclusive, zones of exclusion on the one hand, and on the other hand, a lot of development going into these very specific growth centers where you saw the rents are very high, and a lot of attempt to kind of by developers themselves and the investors who buy those units and the city to a certain extent to kind of extract as much value out of those zones as possible. And so I think that it's important to look at these two sides together and see how they support each other, and they're part of the same system of this kind of financialized landscape of housing and inequality. And so this also, of course, thanks, this one, Anna, yes, ties into what Alan Watts calls the debtscapes, or the sort of geographies of debt. So, and it has a lot to do with who's had housing for a long time and who's trying to get it now. So this inequality between newcomers and young families and like people trying to start out, young people, and some of these incumbent homeowners, especially homeowner investors who have had their house for a long time. And one of the shocking things that I found out through a cross-tabulation table that I ordered was that almost 40% of homeowners in Toronto have paid off their mortgage, and their average monthly costs are $800 a month for houses. So that's 40% of homeowners in Toronto. So that is some of the most affordable housing in Toronto, is actually these homeowner investors who not only are paying very little for housing, but are often overhoused and are in these protected neighborhoods, and they're sitting on a gold mine, because as soon as they go to sell, that house is not going to be affordable anymore. It's not going to, the next person who buys it is not going to be paying $800 a month. So my contribution to the conversation is to try to bring in space, because we've talked a lot about money, but also to bring in the question of who, and like who's living where the bodies are, where the life is, and how we can get back to the story of home as a place for life instead of home as an expectation of a profit. And so that's a kind of normative question, and it's a story that we need to tell. And I think that's how we can get where everyone was talking about we want to go today, by telling that story to the City of Toronto, telling that story to the province, telling that story to each other, and you know, for those of us who do own homes, reminding ourselves that it's not about investing, that it's about having a place to live and having a place to live for everyone. So what that might mean in practice, I'm going to throw a few ideas out. And these are just ideas, but maybe it means that we don't build any more condos. Maybe it means that we do rental-only zones, like Vancouver is trying, or we reverse the Condo Act, I don't know. Or maybe the condos that we build all have 3 bedrooms, as my friend suggested. Or maybe the condo boards are all tenants, including renters, and not just owners. And it's a more democratic governance. And maybe the condo fees are lower, so condos are actually more affordable in perpetuity, and it's not about how many amenities the building has, but actually just, you know, like keeping rents low, or that low. So another part that Gordy talked about a lot was the potential for tenant organization, and I think this encompasses things like rent control and rent strikes when necessary, and also potentially a tenants union that would counterbalance the power of the landlords and the financialized investors, to try to push back against that imbalance of power. And this gets back to the point of seeing tenants as full citizens and not requiring this like normative ownership thing as a requirement for being like a person, a real person. Then there's something, an idea about this. Someone was talking today about this windfall that people get, the landowners get from just owning land in the city. And I think this windfall has happened to these incumbent homeowners as well. They've seen the price of their home go way up, and so there's a potential there to capture a lot of money and put it towards housing affordability. There's been a lot of like, how do we pay for all this housing that we need that's going to be affordable? So one thing we could do, which is building on Alan's suggestion, he talked about capturing wealth through like capital gains inclusion, but you could also think about extending that to homeowner investors and saying maybe we need a capital gains tax on homes that people own and live in, and that would immediately bring down the cost of these homes, but would also create a lot of revenue. And you could do it in a way that wouldn't hurt people in terms of like it would be due upon sale, it wouldn't include renovation costs, you could do it after, like adjust for inflation and all these things so that it wouldn't be like a punitive thing. And then, there's my research focuses on how we can reimagine residential zones. And so, again, these are all just ideas. I don't know if they're the right ideas. We need to talk about it and figure it out. But one of the conversations was around these station areas and around, what if we allow certain densification as of right in some of these neighborhoods and at the same time require affordability through it? So how do we make that idea bigger than just like the kind of technicalities that we've been focusing on today and really reimagining where people are going to live? So do we really want everyone on the busy streets and the highways and not in the residential neighborhoods that are nice and protected and green and all that? And if we build more housing, affordable housing in these areas, what would that look like? Now, there's a few examples. Seattle had this coalition called HALA, Housing Affordability Livability Association, or something like that. And it was a coalition of young renters, of affordable housing activists, of environmentalists, and of the city eventually. They brought in the regional government and some developers. And what they did was they knocked on everyone's door in what they called urban villages, so everything, all these huge areas around that were transit accessible, and talked to them about this idea. And then they also had lots of meetings, community meetings. They did a survey, and they really put a lot of effort into actually going out and having this massive conversation about what this was. And they framed it as, will you be my neighbor? Will you let more people into your neighborhood? Can we live together? And so they were able to then do inclusionary upzoning in 20% of the city. And they figured out what the right ratio was for them, for their economy, in terms of how deeply affordable the units are, which were for 60% of average market rent, and how long, it was like 75 years, and to what percentage of total units, and it ranged between 5 and 11. But those are the details for Seattle, so we have to figure out what's appropriate for Toronto without actually disincentivizing development. And then this ties in also to the fundamental idea of land. So this is what Tash and Sean were talking about. Co-ops, land trusts, ways of getting land out of the investment market and putting it into the public good and taking that aspect of the cost out of it. And so, again, there's lots of examples. People have talked about them today. And I think it would be fun to try to think about how that could be combined with some of these other things, like this transforming neighborhoods. And if we had all this windfall tax, could we like buy up land around stations, put it in trust, and then have it be perpetually community run? So this is about having collective ownership of land to get it out of the market, but it's also collective management. So it's like this kind of concept of we're making these decisions democratically together about how land is used. And that actually brings me to another way to think about land, which is about how to decolonize land and actually, in a real way, give it back to First Nations. So this is a particular legal mechanism that's being used in, and has been used a bit coercively in like Winnipeg, but is now being used in Vancouver to say, okay, any urban land that's given back as part of like some kind of a reconciliation or an urban reserve, all that land can then be converted into a First Nations development area, at which point the First Nations can do what they want with it, and they can develop what they need, and the zoning doesn't apply to them. And so, it's interesting to see that right near the Burrard Bridge in Vancouver, they're going to be building rental housing, and it's going to be for urban Aboriginal people primarily, and it's going to be affordable. And so you really see this sense of the possibilities there, especially given that the gentleman who talked about all the people under the radar, there's so many people that aren't counted in the census, and those include homeless people and people who are just not showing up in this conversation and not counted. So this is a potential to really like kind of counteract that. And then the final idea would be, one of the reasons that in Toronto, that our homeless shelters are so full is because of the rental housing crunch, but it's also because there's refugees in the shelters. And so a very simple idea could be, could we build homes for refugees with public resources? And this might actually tie into our global planetary responsibilities for climate change and climate change refugees, and being part of a global community in that way, across borders. So, I don't know, so these are just some ideas, and I guess I just wanted to ask, I want to invite you to be active with me, to be activists, to say, how can we get there? How can we change the story and find the city as a place for all? I don't know, Janice, do you want to come up and finish? Yeah.
Yes, hi. I just had it's fantastic what, thank you for this conference today, but a while ago, about a year ago, a little over a year ago, a year and a half, I saw this news report where the city was saying that they had to have new development around the transit lines. And that I think in there somewhere as well that they wanted affordable housing or whatever development going on. But at this point, I see a lot of developers just rushing in to build and putting in applications as fast as they can around these transit centers. And now it's just sort of a little bit too much of a coincidence that they asked, that the developers have to develop around, or anybody has to develop around, like the TTC transit lines. And now, like a year later, there's this, the Bill 108 that's coming into fruition, hopefully not. But in retrospect, now all of a sudden it's like this big announcement that they have to build around there. But so now all these developers are rushing. But now there's going to be no chance now that this inclusionary zoning is limited to those transit areas. But as well, and as another comment, another observation is Mr. Layton was saying that, that the public should band around like ACORN and come together with ACORN But isn't it the councillor's responsibility? Why doesn't the councillor ask for public health, not where the public has to go to Acorn and say, okay, that we have to band together to do that, but isn't that they're representing the constituents? And if the councillors are saying that they're at the mercy of the province and the Ontario Planning Act, that their hands are tied, why can't the councillors come to us? The public can ask for help or make those media announcements public and say, okay, public, you know, there's a housing crisis, so let's fight the province. I know in a perfect world, or my world, right, that hopefully that maybe that's one of the solutions to try and get the public involved and the councillors asking the public for help instead of you know, asking the public to go to Acorn, which they're doing a very honorable thing and very amazing thing in their work, but the councillors, I think, need to band together and ask for our help. So I just wanted to make that comment.
Oh, sure, yeah. Okay. Yeah, I love that idea of, you know, the city, instead of feeling like their hands are tied, are saying, can appeal to the public and say, we need your help. So, yeah, I think there's one person to respond from the Metro Tenants Federation, and I don't know. I also was thinking of asking someone here who's from Minneapolis to talk about what's been happening there around they're using the language of civil rights and specifically addressing the kind of racist and exclusionary past of zoning, and which is also heteronormative, to specifically change things there. So it was a wonderful kind of story that they're telling there and logic, but I'm not sure if we have time for that today, Sam. But let's hear from the Metro Tenants person who wanted to respond, and maybe that's the end of the day.
We gotta save that applause for 1 second here. Yeah.
Stand here? Do you want me to go up there? Oh, whatever. Okay. Is this on? Okay. I will just stay here. I'm Helen Lee. I'm a board member of the Federation of Metro Tenants Associations. So if you guys were here earlier this morning, I'm one of Jordy Dent's bosses, is how I usually introduce myself. I'm also a tenant advocate. As a paralegal who works in housing, I represent tenants only. Obviously, I do work on a volunteer basis for the FMTA. I do social media for them and all things communications. And I try to convince the folks at City Hall to give more of a shit about tenants in Toronto, but also in Ontario. I know, after a day of talking all things affordable housing, that things seem kind of doom and gloom. I look around the room, a lot of you folks are younger. Maybe a lot of you guys are studying geography and planning. I'm a proud alumna of the University of Toronto Scarborough, of their city studies program of 08, which tells you how old I am. But no, I approach my work from the lens of somebody who was born and raised in Toronto, somebody who loves this city and who's willing to fight for it. I always believe that it doesn't matter who you are, where you're from, what language you speak, what you believe, who you love. There will be a place for you in Toronto. I think that extends to, how much money you make. But unfortunately, the last few years, we're seeing Toronto become a city more of the haves and the have-nots. Those of us who work in social justice have been having a rough go at it. We have a provincial government who is all too happy to be in the pockets of the developer industry, and who have changed the laws to make it all that much tougher for regular people. And in that context, again, a lot of doom and gloom. But I take solace in community activism, in the efforts of folks like Acorn, in the efforts of folks from the Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust, but also every single one of you who decided to come out here on a Saturday to spend your day learning about affordable housing. So what's next? I can say from the FMTA, we are always looking for volunteers. I've done social media for them, and I've been a one-person team. I would like to offload that onto a dedicated social media team. I would usually be live tweeting an event like this, but I decided to come here as a participant and just listen. You know, I want a team of folks who can advance our work. I encourage everyone to get involved with ACORN. I encourage everyone to, you know, call, write your city councilor, your MPP, your MP. We have a federal election this year. You know, I can say that, you know, it can be very discouraging, but I will say, and if, you know, regular person, how do you get involved? You're on social media, tweet to your elected representative, you know, make phone calls, okay? The staffers, they can easily ignore emails, but they will track calls. Call up your elected representative and tell them you care about making Toronto a more livable city, that they should invest in affordable housing. So these are the first steps you can take. And I am available if you have any other questions, comments, other ways to get involved. But I want to thank the School of Cities, Jeremy, the other team of folks, the volunteers in the back over there who are trying to handle the food situation, whose names I didn't get, but thank you for your efforts as well to make this day a very interesting day. And like Jordy said before, don't despair. There is hope. And we are trying to fight the good fight. And we ask that all of you join as well. So thanks.
I just wanted to add one quick thing about how to get involved, which is that we started the day talking about the housing plan that the city is developing for the next 10 years, 2020 to 2030. There's still an online questionnaire that's up. It's going to be open until June 30th. So anyone who wants to put forward their thoughts about how we can get affordable housing done, we heard amazing ideas here today. If lots of people fill out questionnaires with some of these great ideas, that will have an impact as well. So the URL is long and complicated, but if you just Google Housing Plan Toronto, it's the first result that comes up, and the questionnaire is a big button right on that first page.
Okay, thank you so much, everyone. Like, we went over time, but the fact that we've still got, what, like 150 people here just shows how important this issue is. Like, thank you to Anna so much. Like, she's helped a great deal with this. Felicity in the back, Darian, Alan Walks, I don't know, Julie Ma. We're gonna have a lot of fights on our hands coming up. Inclusionary zoning, it's about to be wrestled by the province from our hands. A municipality has fought for the right to legislate this, and we're gonna have to fight back in the next months. I don't know, disrupt Queen's Park as they go through with this. But there's so many fights like that coming up the next few months. So I don't know, we've heard from a lot of great organizations about how you can get involved. We've heard the numbers about how far behind our city is compared to a lot of other cities, and how many powers we have in our grasp to turn this around. So thank you everyone for coming out, and I look forward to seeing you around. I'm sure I will. I already know so many of you already.